So I have to confess that there are some passages that you come across when you're using the lectionary that you just kind of go, what is that about? And I have to confess that this is one of those passages. When I initially encountered it, thinking about what we were going to share today, I said, spit and crumbs. All right, lot to work with. But I think it's in those times that God prompts us to go deeper into his word and to study and really find out what he has for us in those passages. So that is what I have attempted to do, and it is my prayer that my study will be a blessing to us as we look at this passage together. So the first thing we need to do is figure out some geography. Geography was not my big strong suit in school. I have to confess that as well. The first account of the Syrian Phoenician woman's daughter's healing was in Tyre and Sidon, which you can see are in red. This is the modern day equivalent of the coast of Lebanon. But at that time, the Greeks had named it Phoenicia, and specifically Syrian Phoenicia, to distinguish it from a Phoenicia that happened to be in North Africa. So the Phoenicia comes from the Greek word for purple. And the reason that Greeks named this region, Tyre and Sidon, purple was because there was a shell called a mollusk that they used to extract a purple dye out of. And that purple dye would be used to color clothing, and it actually was a pretty big commodity that they would then export to the rest of the Mediterranean world from their port cities. So the Greeks kind of nicknamed this place the purple place because the purple dye came out of the mollusks. So this woman was from Syrian Phoenicia, or the purple place. Jesus had referenced a few times to his disciples in prior accounts that the gospel was going to go to the Gentiles eventually. And not everybody believed it, but it's clear from this account that that was his intent. It says specifically that Jesus went to this area. It's away from the area that he normally was ministering in, and it was predominantly Gentile area. So we, with 2015 eyes, when we read the Bible, think, oh, that's not a big deal, he traveled. Well, it is a big deal, because it was an area of Gentiles, which the Pharisees would have frowned upon Jesus being there. He tried to hide there, but he was getting away for some quiet time. His cousin, John the Baptist, had recently been killed, and he wanted some quiet time. But the scripture specifically says he couldn't kind of get that quiet time. He was famous. People knew where he was, and they came and they flocked to him. See, for Jesus to be in this Gentile area, this purple area, would have made him ritually unclean according to strict Old Testament law. He was not supposed to be there. He was not supposed to be interacting with the Canaanite pagans. And the Canaanite paganism had been there for a long time, back to Jezebel in the Old Testament. So Jesus crosses this geographic border and this language barrier, because we're going to see that he speaks in Greek rather than his native Aramaic. And he crosses the social convention of men and women speaking to each other. Again, in Jewish circles, had he been in the Jewish part, a woman who was not his wife could not have approached him and asked for healing. So we look at it as not a big deal at all that this woman approached him. In that day and time, it would have been scandalous. She was a Gentile, she was a woman, she was asking for healing. It was quite startling culturally. But she was desperate for healing for her daughter. So Jesus says something to her in verse 27 that seems strange to us. First, let the children eat all they want. for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." And this seems really strange when you first look at it, until you know the context, the cultural sort of bias that existed at that time. The people of Israel, the Jewish people, had been told by God and through his prophets and Moses, all through the Old Testament, you are God's chosen children. You are the chosen nation. You are special. You are set apart. So, quite naturally, the Jewish people believed that they were God's chosen people. But what that bred in them was this sense of superiority over other people, specifically Gentiles. And they started to believe that they were, in fact, the true chosen race, and everybody else was kind of dirty, mangy, like dogs. So if you put those two ideas together, Jesus is essentially saying the blessings or the bread can only be for the chosen children. It's not right to give the blessings for the chosen to the dogs, to the Gentiles. This seems weird to us. This would have been very, very insulting to be called a dog in that day and time. I think if Jesus had said that to me, if I had been bold enough to approach him and Jesus had said, "You don't deserve that kind of blessing. You don't deserve the healing that I give to my children," I would have been shamed into silence, just gone away. But this woman was bold, and she was desperate for healing for her daughter. So she kind of plays along with Jesus. He was kind of poking fun at her. Now, most commentators don't think that Jesus agreed with this insulting characterization, but that he used the vocabulary of the culture to get his point across. He was essentially saying, I know that you're not Jewish, and therefore you shouldn't be asking me for a blessing. So she quips back to him, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. So if you're going to call me a dog, I'm going to go with that analogy and say, yes, but the dogs sometimes get the leftovers." Anybody that has a dog knows that they very often sit near the dinner table waiting for something to drop on the floor. And this is the image that she uses. Dogs, again, not cuddly house pets, but considered kind of dirty and a lesser form of life than a human. See, this woman, she knows her position. She knows that she doesn't deserve to ask Jesus. She doesn't have standing to even approach him. And she says to him, "Just the littlest crumb of blessing is more than enough for me. I don't need to be one of your chosen people. I don't need to be blessed in that way. I just need the leftovers." That's the kind of humble faith that Jesus was looking for, and that he would hoped many Gentiles would come to possess over time. Incidentally, I love this little fact, that this is the only time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus is addressed as Lord. The whole Gospel of Mark, and it's by a Gentile woman. It's pretty unexpected. So Jesus is pleased with her wordplay and says, "For such a reply, go, your daughter is healed." He didn't have to see the daughter. He didn't have to touch the daughter. He just spoke it into existence, and her healing was accomplished immediately. It says when she went home, the demon was gone. Just a scrap, just a crumb of blessing was enough to heal at a distance. She knows that she doesn't deserve Jesus' grace, and yet she has faith. That even the cast-offs, the crumbs, the leftovers are enough for her. See, she understands Jesus' power. So the second account starts in verse 31, and we travel geographically again to the Decapolis. So the Decapolis is over on your right-hand side. It's east of the Sea of Galilee. And it's a grouping of 10 cities, the detail of which is not shown on this map. But there were 10 cities, Greek culture, very culturally rich center, and they shared language and political leaders and things like that. So again, the thing we need to know about the Decapolis is it was predominantly Gentile. That's why those geographic details are included in this passage, to let us know that the gospel is going to the Gentiles. So, as in the first account, it appears that it's Jesus' deliberate plan to be there. It's not someplace he would normally travel, but he went there on purpose. So, this time, the person that needs healing could not even approach Jesus to ask. Not only did he not have standing to ask, but he physically could not speak to ask for healing. He was deaf, and it says he has a speech impediment. And that Greek word is mangalalos. It's the one time it's used in the New Testament. It means speech impediment or inability to speak. So this man couldn't even ask for healing for himself. His friends bring him to Jesus. It reminds me of the account where the other friends dropped the man down through the roof so that Jesus would heal him. He was on his mat, and just friends asking for healing on his behalf. And these friends, we don't know whether they're Greek or Jewish. We assume they're Greek because he uses the word mangalalos. And they ask Jesus, could you just lay a hand on him? Just touch him. It's like just a crumb, just a touch, and that will be enough. We know that he'll be healed. And again, this man would have been considered ritually unclean by the Pharisees, the keepers of the Old Testament ceremonial law. His handicap would have meant that had he been in a Jewish city, he could not have entered the temple. He was considered unclean. But Jesus doesn't play by those rules anymore. Jesus sets aside that ceremonial law of who's clean and who's unclean and who's Jewish and who's Gentile and who's male and who's female, because the greater law of love and grace is what he's instituting. Just lay a hand on him. Just a hand, just a touch. See, Jesus never turned away anybody that came to him in faith. And I love the way that he does this healing. So the healing of the Syrian Phoenician woman's daughter was done at a distance. He didn't meet the daughter, he didn't touch the daughter, he didn't even see the daughter. This man gets so close to the deaf man that he puts his hands in his ears. And then he spits, and he puts the spit on the man's tongue. Now, I don't know about you, but there are very few people I would allow to put their hand in my mouth, right? And all the time that he's doing that, he looks up, because the man can't hear. He can't give him instructions. He looks up and he says, "Be opened." So he's clearly telling the deaf man, the healing's coming from God. And he says, "Be opened," and immediately he was healed. So one healing is at a distance, one is up close and personal and intimate. And I also love the fact that Jesus takes the man off to the side, because often I think handicapped people feel like they're a spectacle, like everybody's staring at them or gawking at them. And Jesus took this man off to the side, and he had this little interaction with him, and then he brought him back to his friends. And what a reaction the friends probably had. Like, What happened? See, his friends knew that just a touch. But Jesus didn't just touch him sort of impersonally. He very personally and intimately healed this man. So I want you to think about a time in your own life when something amazing and great happened to you and you were not supposed to tell anybody about it. For some women in particular, it might be a pregnancy that's still early and you're not telling people about it, but you're really excited, or a new job, or a new family member getting married and you're not supposed to share the news yet, or something really, really exciting. This happened to us, of course, about a month ago when we had our wonderful candidating weekend here and the vote was to call us to come. And both Howard and I were so excited, and yet when we went back to Massachusetts, we had to keep quiet because we hadn't finished our other ministry assignment yet and we couldn't tell them. But it was hard to keep it in. The excitement was so palpable for us. And that's how these people felt. Jesus said, "Don't tell anybody." Really? The man was miraculously healed of a lifelong handicap. Really? Quiet? Probably not. It's hard to keep a secret. And Jesus says specifically, Mark says, Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking. People were overwhelmed and amazed. The reaction is interesting because he says specifically, he has done everything well. Now, we don't know whether the crowd was made up of Jews or Gentiles or both, but this is a direct quote of the language in Genesis 1:31. When God made the heavens and earth and he sat back and said, "It is good." These people said, "He does everything well." And then it says, from our call to worship this morning, Isaiah 35:6, "The lame will leap like deer and the mute tongue shout for joy." So Mark is not being covert in his intent here. He's saying Jesus went to Gentile areas, healed people who were unclean, outsiders, and they knew he was God. They understood the power of God, and they knew that just a crumb or just a touch was more than they needed. It was sufficient. God's abundance is so rich and powerful that even the scraps, the leftovers, are more than enough to meet everyone's needs. He tells the woman that her faith healed her, and he looks up to heaven and says, in effect, the healing's coming from God. So everything about these two accounts is unexpected. The geography, the language, the cultural norms that he violated, the Old Testament law being set aside, and the gospel coming to Gentiles in crumbs and in spit. Jesus uses these unexpected elements to teach us. He teaches us to expect the unexpected. Just when you think you know what Jesus is going to do, he's going to do something unexpected. Do we get that? Do we get that God's love is so abundant and lavish and overflowing and sufficient that it's capable of meeting every need we have? There was a time several years ago, and it's a time I really actually don't like to think about too much. When I went through a really difficult time, I had a group of people who I thought were my friends and even some family members stop speaking to me. And it was really difficult. I was by myself and I felt very alone. I sort of felt like the woman scorned or shunned, and I felt really deserted. And I was sad and I was alone. And yet, God provided for me then. There was one woman, her name is Christine. And she came alongside, and she was my friend when no one else wanted to be my friend. And I count that as God's blessing and God's grace and God's mercy when I didn't deserve it. And I'm hoping that all of you have those moments, not when you feel deserted, but when you have somebody in your life that dispenses grace in a way that you absolutely recognize is the grace of God. I hope that's true for you. I hope that you've experienced healing and grace and mercy from God, and that we can't help telling other people about it, just as the people in our story today.